Hey now! Hello everybody, my name is John Sierra. I am a Tolkien scholar, and I am here to answer your questions about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, whether it's The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, or any other of his works that you can ask me questions. And of course, any question that you can ask in a comment, though I prefer you do it on Quora. If you look in the description, there is a link to my Quora account. Very easy to ask a question on there. You can log in. Making an account is super easy. You can use a Facebook, or I believe a Google account as well. And you'll have the link to my account. You can just easily tag me in any question. Ask to answer, they call it. So anyway, I have 15 questions here submitted throughout the last week, and I'm gonna get comfortable here, guys. I'm an experienced YouTuber. This is only my third video on this channel, but I have been doing YouTube on my gaming channel for 11 years. And I have to tell you, through speaking into a microphone when I'm gaming or on Twitch or just chatting or whatever is always so easy and natural for me. But whenever I sit down to do one of these, I feel really, really nervous. It's like starting all over again. And I suppose that's kind of a good thing. But let's get to your questions. So this first question was submitted by Peter Klings, and Peter asks, does the insistence on describing meals in Tolkien's story The Lord of the Rings tell of an age of food shortages when it was written? I could see how you'd come up with that if that was true. But it's sort of a myth. It's even a meme, I would say, that The Lord of the Rings is like a Hobbit food blog, a travelogue, where they give reviews of various meals throughout the land. It's not true. The fact that it's filled with numerous and detailed accounts of meals, it's a big and very persistent myth about The Lord of the Rings. And I've seen it in memes, and I mean memes that go back further than the movies. This is something that people were saying, back when I was a kid, that, oh, they just eat all the time. From what I could tell, it's been around forever, but I have no idea where it came from. I really don't. I don't know where it started. It's not actually true. Even in The Hobbit, there's not that many descriptions of meals. You have like an unexpected party, and it describes the vast amounts of foodstuffs that Bilbo's guests, the 13 dwarves and Gandalf, devour. But beyond that, okay, they talk about food when he arrives at Beorn's place, but it's sort of because between leaving Bag End and arriving at Beorn's place, Bilbo barely got to eat. He certainly wasn't eating 6 to 7 meals a day. So it was sort of like this bountiful feast out of nowhere, it was a relief. And that's really the case. Tolkien doesn't really describe meals unless it's plot relevant. In Lord of the Rings, let's see, so Frodo, Sam, and Pippin hook up with the host of Gildor and Glorian, and they're fed and sheltered for a little while, but they don't even really go into a lot of detail about the food. It's mostly about the elven liquor that the elves give to Frodo, Merry, and... No, I said Pippin, didn't I? No, Merry wasn't there. I'm sorry. See, I said Frodo, Merry, and Pippin. It's Frodo, Sam, and Pippin. Yeah, Merry wasn't there. Gimli devoured a lembas when they gave the lembas to the party and the Fellowship of the Ring, and he ate when he thought it was cram, and it wasn't, and that was just sort of like, this is magic elf bread, it's very special, it's not the same thing as cram, and that's because it was plot relevant, and the lembas bread would continue to be important, especially for Frodo and Sam. Of herbs and stewed rabbits, Sam cooked a rabbit. It was mentioned at that point that he had cooked most of the meals for the Fellowship, but we don't get descriptions of those meals. It was just like, that Sam was into cooking and that he was a very good cook. So really, this was plot relevant because it was Sam trying to bond with Gollum, and it didn't work out that well, because he kept telling Gollum, go get me rabbits, Gollum, go get me water, and then he wanted to get him herbs, and Gollum drew the line there, keep your nasty chips, and then I remember in The Return of the King, Pippin kept asking about food. At one point, Gandalf gave him a piece of bread. And basically that's what it comes down to, is that descriptions of meals in The Lord of the Rings is usually something like, they ate a poor breakfast and moved on, or they ate what they could hurriedly and then continued the journey. And I think it's less about that there were food shortages in England and more about the fact that the author had been to war. And when you're at war, you don't have time to sit and enjoy a nice meal. So on those rare occasions where these travelers who are in fact at war or are exiles are able to sit and enjoy a meal, it's a rare occasion. And it's not so much about the food, but about the fellowship, about the discussions they have and how the plot moves forward. If anything, if there's one thing that Tolkien goes into great detail about, it's certainly not food, but scenery. The man loved to describe the scenery to you. It's definitely more of a travelogue than a food blog. All right, this question was submitted anonymously. What are some of the most impressive feats or fights from the Silmarillion? So there's a lot, but I decided to talk about just one, and that would be Eärendil, that's Elrond's father, taking down Ancalagon the Black. So Ancalagon the Black was the greatest, mightiest winged dragon in Tolkien's entire history, and he was killed by an elf, Eärendil the Mariner, and a swarm of eagles. So the battle happened entirely in the sky, and it went on for a full day. All day and all night, they battled in the sky until finally Ancalagon the Black fell, and he landed on Thongorodrim, which is a cluster of 3 volcanoes. And it was said that the dragon fell with such violence that the volcanoes were destroyed by the dragon's fall. Now think of the sheer size and, more importantly, the scope of this. The dragon was so large and fearsome that his ruin destroyed several fiery mountains. This gives you an idea of how imposing Ancalagon the Black was, and he was defeated by an elf in a magic boat and some birds. It's a fantastic battle. I mean, imagine seeing that in a movie, right? Maybe one day we'll get a novel. There's been several novels that expanded upon aspects of the Silmarillion. There was 3 that expanded on the first age. We had Children of Hurin, and Beren and Luthien, and The Fall of Gondolin, and then there was another one, The Fall of Numenor, that just came out last year. Still written by Tolkien, though. Even though he's been dead for a long time, he's still somehow coming out with posthumous novels. That just came out last year, and that's more about, the Second Age of Numenor, but I'm hoping maybe we can get like a War of Wrath novel that would go into more detail about this period of 40 years known as the War of Wrath, and maybe we can get an epic description of the battle between Eärendil and Ancalagon the Black, much as we got in The Fall of Gondolin, we got a way better description of Glorfindel fighting a Balrog, so... good question. Okay, so this next question is another anonymous one, and this person simply asks, should I read The Lord of the Rings first, or should I read The Hobbit first? Read The Hobbit first. Please, I beg of you, read The Hobbit first. Now, there's a lot of reasons to do this. The events of The Hobbit happened before the events of Lord of the Rings. The Hobbit was written before The Lord of the Rings. It's both story order and publication order. And The Lord of the Rings has a lot of references to what happened in The Hobbit. Now, if you don't read The Hobbit first, it does sort of give you sort of a broad strokes retelling of it real quick at the very beginning. But you really want to have read The Hobbit. And another reason is that it just works better. If you were to read The Lord of the Rings and then go back and read The Hobbit, it's a big tonal shift. The Hobbit was sort of like a children's story. It's whimsical, there's some danger, and it's a fun, light read. And then if you were going from The Return of the King, which is anything but what I just said, into that, it's jarring. But if you look at Book 1, which is the first half of The Fellowship of the Ring, it's actually tonally fairly similar to The Hobbit. It sort of eases you into the darker, more complex story that The Lord of the Rings is, coming from The Hobbit. So it definitely flows better. Please read The Hobbit first. Okay. This next question... Oh, another anonymous one. Okay. I love this question. This is probably my favorite question of the week. What did the Shire represent to J.R.R. Tolkien? So the Shire represents a lot of things to a lot of people. And that's just the way that Tolkien wrote. But to Tolkien himself, it represents one thing. It represents the idea of home, right? Now, Tolkien very much the way that he did not want to tell the reader, this is what the Shire represents, this is what it is, and anything else is incorrect because it's not what I had in mind. That would be allegory. And Tolkien disliked allegory. He wanted applicability. He wanted the reader to have freedom. He called it, as a matter of fact, in his exact words, the freedom of the reader to apply the lessons that you learn or the things that you feel to a great many number of things that you can come up with. So the Shire might mean something different to myself or to yourself or to whomever out there, but to Tolkien, I feel it represents home. It was the verdant hills of England of the youth of the author before he went off to fight in the Great War. And then he returned after fighting in the Great War and found his home had changed. And that's like kind of what you see with the scouring of the Shire, because, a lot of people misinterpret the term the scouring of the Shire. They say that Saruman scoured the Shire. No, Saruman did not scour the Shire. Merry and Pippin, and many other hobbits, but chiefly Merry and Pippin scoured the Shire, because to scour something means to cleanse it. Tolkien returned home and found that his home had changed. It wasn't as green. There were more machines. There was more industrialization. He wasn't a kid anymore, and his childhood home had changed in a very irrevocable way. When you write a fantasy story, you can have your magic little hobbit guys come in and be the heroes and fix all that. They can scour it, they can cleanse it, they can bust up all the machines, regrow the trees, and put it back to the way that it was. And that's what makes it a fantasy story. They say you can't go home again, but the hobbits certainly did. At least Merry, Pippin, and Sam did. Frodo, it was a little more complicated. So that's not to say that everyone must see the Shire as home. Tolkien would be aghast if I was to say that that's what it is and that's the only thing it can be, because that's what allegory is, when it represents one thing. But it actually can represent many things. But if you're asking me what Tolkien would have thought, I believe that's what he would have thought. It would have been home. Okay, so this next question was asked by Laurel Callahan. And Laurel asks, in reference to the Beacons of Gondor, did they only work one way? Meaning that only Gondor could call Rohan for aid, or could Rohan also have lit the beacons to call Gondor for aid as well? So this is definitely a question relating to the Peter Jackson films. The Beacons of Gondor are in the books, but they work differently. And I can't speak to the films. I can assume that if Rohan needed aid, they could light the beacons themselves and it would go in the opposite direction. I'm not sure how that would have worked in the films, but in the books, when Gandalf and Pippin rode towards Minas Tirith, the beacons were already lit. There was no need to convince Denethor to do this. He had already done it. But the purpose of the Beacons of Gondor was not to call Rohan for aid. It was actually to call Gondor itself for aid. What you have to understand is that Gondor is a big country, and there's many different smaller sections of it that all have their own lords and their own peoples. And the beacons did go all the way north towards Rohan, but they also went south and east and west. And it was basically saying everybody needs to get to Minas Tirith and defend. And that's why Pippin sees men from all over Gondor over the next few days arrive at Minas Tirith with their hosts to defend the city. Now for Rohan, they actually sent a messenger to Edoras, to the which is the city, specifically to Meduseld, which is the estate of Theoden, the king of the Mark, and they bring him a ceremonial red arrow. It's a regular arrow that was painted red, and it presenting this to the king of Rohan, the king of the Mark, is the ceremonial way of stating that Gondor calls for aid. And of course, Theoden actually already knew that Gondor was in very big need of aid. He had been told that already, and he was doing something called the Muster of Rohan, which was gathering his forces together, the Rohirrim, so that they could all march to Minas Tirith. and the messenger from Gondor bringing the arrow was sort of the official political statement, but he was already planning on going, and the messenger himself was important because he said, hey, we need you like yesterday. You need to hurry. And that made Theoden hurry. And when the men of Rohan hurry, they get there, because they are the Horse Lords after all. Okay, good question. So this next one was asked by Jack Fraser. Jack Fraser asks, I love this. You don't get to many questions about werewolves, Tolkien's werewolves that often. So he asks, was Tolkien's mythology, in Tolkien's mythology, more properly, were werewolves most likely fallen Maiar that decided to take the shapes of giant wolves? No, definitely not. I don't think that they were ever Maiar. I think that they were wolves. They were actual wolves, and that they were enhanced by Sauron's necromancy. So, Tolkien's werewolves are not like your typical pop culture werewolves, where you have a man that turns into a wolf. And if you look at the linguistics behind it, were means man, man-wolf, right? Tolkien took a different approach to the idea of the man-wolf, and the werewolves themselves are actually more similar to dire wolves, which are an extinct relative of wolves. Dire wolves are real, or at least they were real, and they were just very, very large wolves that existed a long time ago and are now extinct. Tolkien's werewolves are like that. Now, the first werewolf in Tolkien's universe, aside from Sauron, who had many different forms, one of which was the form of a great wolf, was Dragluin. Now, Dragluin was bred from the great wolves and then inhabited by an evil spirit from Sauron. We have to understand that Sauron is also a necromancer, and taking the spirit of, say, a dead man and putting it into a wolf is a way of making a man-wolf or a werewolf. So, and then if you look at how this happened, in the Third Age we have wargs, which are intelligent wolves. They can even speak, which suggests that they have what Tolkien calls a thear, or a soul. So if they have if the wargs have thear, this suggests that they have souls that they can speak and communicate. And it's likely that they're actually descended from these werewolves, which started out as normal wolves, but that through necromancy, the souls of men were put into them. So that's sort of like the way that the werewolves were created. They certainly weren't Maiar, like, say, the Balrogs were. Okay, so this next question, this is an anonymous one. This is about the Army of the Dead, and this person just asked, who are the Army of the Dead? Are they deceased men of Gondor? They're from somewhere else? Well, what's their whole deal? So, the Army of the Dead, they're actually called the Dead Men of Dunharrow. They were kind of a cautionary tale, and there's a lot of these in Tolkien's work about taking an oath. It's a very, very important thing that you keep that oath, even if it's a terrible oath. We saw that with Feanor. Feanor and his sons took an awful, terrible oath that they should not have done, and they did horrible, horrible things because the oath was that strong. The Dead Men of Dunharrow is basically what happens to you if you don't follow the oath. So, so Aragorn saw in the Palantir a great many things. And one of them was that there was a lot of danger to the southern shores of Gondor, an area called Pelargir. So he decided to take the Paths of the Dead, which is there's a mountain pass. It's a pass that goes south straight through the mountains. And no one had ever returned from this. Éowyn begged him not to go. If you go that way, you're dead. That's just the way it works. Nobody's ever returned. So Aragorn went along with Legolas, Gimli, and a whole bunch of the Dunedain, the Rangers of the North, which included Elrohir and Elladan. That's Arwen's brothers and good friends of Aragorn. And they all went in there willingly. Gimli was not super happy about it, but he did go in there. He thought it was odd that an elf would go underground where a dwarf would not, because Legolas was just like, I'm not afraid of ghosts. They're dead. They can't hurt me, right? So basically, the men of Dunharrow had swore a sacred oath to Isildur, stating that they would aid him in the war against Sauron. This was in the Second Age, but they didn't do it. They never joined the Last Alliance. They did not fight Sauron, and because of this, they were denied the gift of man. The gift of man is essentially death. They were denied death. They died, but they could not pass into the afterlife. They could not meet Eru Ilúvatar. They could not walk whatever path it is that dead men walk and go to whatever place it is that Eru has set aside for mortal men. They were just sort of stuck. They became wraiths. So Aragorn and his host rode through the mountain pass, and they reached the place where the oath had been taken, the Stone of Erech. And as they had been traveling towards the stone, the dead started following them. They started creeping in from behind. And Aragorn said, "I am here to hold you to your oath." And the dead men of Dunharrow said, "We are here to fulfill our oath." And Aragorn rode straight through towards the south, towards Pelargir, and he had an entire army of the dead following him. And people saw him, and they went inside. They couldn't bear to look at him. He was the king of the dead. And he went to Pelargir, and there were the corsairs and the mercenaries of Sauron that were sneakily flanking Gondor by attacking from the south. And the dead army came upon them, and these guys took one look at it, and they just went in the other direction. They was like, nope, 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 nope. And that's the power of the dead army. They can't really fight, but they can induce incredible fear in mortal men. And then they dissipated because Aragorn was an heir of Isildur, and they had fulfilled their oath, because it was not until they fulfilled their oath to one of Isildur's heirs that they could ever actually pass away. They were dead, but they had not passed away. Good question. Okay, so here's another one of my favorites. This was John Thompson asked this one. I like this. What would it have taken to have created a Lord of the Rings adaptation that Tolkien would have actually liked? It would have taken a miracle. It would have taken a miracle. I do feel like if Tolkien had gotten to see the Peter Jackson films, there would have been sort of a mixed reaction from him, I think. On the one hand, he would have been impressed. He would have been impressed with how the characters in the world came to life, the look of it, the acting, the effects, all of it, especially the scenery. I spoke earlier about how much he liked to describe scenery, and Peter Jackson went through great pains to make everything look the way that it should in terms of scenery. But he would have had, some issues with a lot of the changes that were made, and generally speaking, he didn't really like adaptations. He did sell the rights to Lord of the Rings as an adaptation, but he didn't really like adaptations. He felt that they missed the point by their very nature. I'm not saying I agree with that. I'm saying that that's what he felt. So he just didn't trust adaptations. So if you understand his attitude towards adaptations, I think that even if you did a very literal translation from page to screen that was just slavishly devoted to getting everything exactly the same that he wrote it, I don't think it would have impressed him all that much. I think he would grumble that it missed the point. And that's simply because it's in a completely different medium. So, yeah, I think it would have taken a miracle for us to create, us, and I mean us as a people, to create a film or a series or whatever that he would have really loved. Because I think that Tolkien's attitude would have been, if Lord of the Rings was supposed to be a movie, I would have made it as a movie. So, that's sort of where that goes. Okay, the next question is from Jose RM, who asks, how much time did the elves have to stop using the three rings? Did their lands suffer any decay? So, it was quite a long time, by human standards at least, that the elves had to not use their rings of power. So the elves, they all took off their rings, the elves of Eregion, once they heard the voice of Sauron coming through the rings. They heard that incantation in the Black Speech that translates to one ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. This would have been in 1600 of the Second Age. So Sauron came to Eregion and stole all the rings back except for 3 that he just didn't know about or could not find. And those were hidden He didn't know about them. However, while he had the ruling ring, it was not safe to wear those rings. He lost the ring at the Battle of the Last Alliance of Elves and Men, and that's in 3441 of the Second Age. So 1841 years, the elves could not use the Rings of Power. But once Sauron was defeated and he lost the ring, and the Third Age started, it became safe for them to do it. Because the ring... I mean, Isildur had the ring. They probably didn't wear their rings right away until it was said that the One Ring was lost. Because, who knows, maybe Isildur could have become the next Dark Lord. I don't think that would have happened because he's a mortal man, but... and he was a good person, too. But I don't think that they would have felt safe wearing it until Isildur had passed. So, basically, throughout most of the Third Age... the elves, and eventually Gandalf, because Círdan passed his ring to Gandalf, would have been able to use the rings just fine. But a long time before that, 1840 some odd years, they couldn't use the rings, really. Not safely. Okay, so this question is from Zorua Galaxy, I guess like the Pokemon. This is about the Entwives. Were the Ents and Entwives around during the start of the Second Age in the forest of Eriador in The Lord of the Rings? The Ents were absolutely around. I mean, they date back to the First Age and maybe even before the First Age, maybe the years of the trees they were around. The Entwives, well, it's a little up for debate about the Entwives because we don't know quite when they disappeared fully. The prevailing theory of what happened to the Entwives is they died. And when asked about their fate, Tolkien stated that he didn't know, but he feared that they died, but did not know the details exactly how they would have. What we do know is that sometime either late in the First Age or early in the Second Age, the Entwives moved further away from the male Ents. They were traveling, and they were never seen again. The most common theory is that they were killed by Sauron, basically. Not directly that he came specifically to kill Entwives, but that he razed and burned a whole big patch of land, and it was the same area that they were last seen in. He was trying to halt the Last Alliance by burning and razing the land. And it's thought that maybe they got caught up in that, and that they all burned up and died. So, and that's certainly plausible. It seems likely that they were around at the beginning of the Second Age, though. It's possible that their disappearance, as in the last time they were seen by the Ents, may have been in the First Age. They probably were around at least through part of the Second Age, and possibly well into the Second Age. They just weren't seen. So, there is, of course, I do have to mention this, there's an outside chance that the Entwives didn't die, and that they were still around, possibly even in the Third Age, as there were reports of Ent-like creatures near the Shire in the Old Forest. And though this was never actually confirmed, Treebeard did wonder if the Entwives might have made their way up to that forest and stated that that is an area that they would have loved. So, we don't know, really. Okay, so this next question was asked by... Oh, I hope I'm saying this right. Is it How Santos? I hope I'm saying your name right, but How here asks, if Melkor had found love either with Varda or Luthien, could that have redeemed him? Or would he be a poor, narcissistic lover? So, I think that the question is presupposed upon the notion that Melkor turned to evil because he didn't find love. Because Varda rejected him, he became evil. And I think that's incorrect. I think it's the other way around. I would say that because of the evil that was already there festering inside of him, that is the reason that Varda rejected him. She knew what he was all about. She knew what he was, and she knew what he would become, and she didn't want any part of that. Varda may have been the most wise being in all of the universe except for Eru Ilúvatar himself, and she wouldn't have fallen for that sort of like, I can fix him. That would have never entered her mind. So I think any poor soul that became romantically entangled with Melkor would be corrupted like him. So I don't think that entering into a relationship, whether it's with Varda or Luthien or whomever, it's not going to make Melkor better. It's going to make the other person worse. Okay. This next question was submitted by Elizabeth McDougall. Elizabeth sends me a lot of questions, and I like her submissions a lot. She especially likes to send questions regarding the linguistic aspects, and that's definitely this question. The Silmarillion says that the Sindarin elves of Beleriand called Sauron Gorthaur, and yes, you did spell that right. When and how did he come to be known as Sauron in the later ages? So, Sauron had a lot of names, and they're almost all just different languages. The second Dark Lord's true name is Maiar, which means the Admirable. But due to his actions, the elves gave him some insulting names to call him instead of that. So in Sindarin, he was called Gorthaur, which means the Cruel. And in Quenya, he was called Sauron, which means the Abhorred. In the Second Age, the men of Numenor called him Zigur, which means the Sorcerer. And he called himself Anatar, which means the Lord of Gifts. And he also called himself Tar Mairan, which means the Admirable King. So, for the reason that the name Sauron caught on and Gorthaur did not, well, The Lord of the Rings was already written, right? Like, that was written, published before the Silmarillion was ever finished. Not that the Silmarillion was ever actually finished, but it wasn't published until after the death of the author, and we already knew him as Sauron, so he was going to be Sauron no matter what. Gorthaur, they called him that in Beleriand, and that might be why. Beleriand's not around anymore, it was destroyed. And it could have just been the regional aspect of it, that's what he was called in Beleriand. And now that Beleriand is gone, we call him Sauron. So that's my best stab at that one. Okay, another anonymous question here. Did Sauron ever serve anyone? If so, who would it be and why did he choose to serve them? So he did indeed serve others, three others as a matter of fact, all for different reasons. So firstly, as the Mairan, he would have been a servant of Eru Iluvatar. All of the Ainur were in fact servants of Iluvatar, and they were all in a place called the Timeless Void initially. And he would have participated in Ainur Landale, the music of the Ainur, or the first music. Unlike Melkor, it wasn't mentioned that he tried anything weird here. He didn't try to mess up the music or sing his own themes or anything like that. So basically, he was going along with God and the angels, his fellow angels. He was singing the same song as everybody else, except for Melkor. So he was definitely serving Eru at this point. So secondly, Mairan came to be under the tutelage of the Valar Aula, who is the smith of the Valar. Now, all of the Maiar would serve one or more Valar, and it seemed that there was actually some choice involved in this. It wasn't like they were assigned to specific Valar. They chose who they were going to learn from, who they were going to serve. So Mairan choosing Aula, it actually makes sense. It's a manifestation of the nature of Mairan. He's a lord of order. He loves order, and Aule being a smith and a creator, I could see sort of the attraction there of the order of creation. Lastly, Mairan chose to serve Melkor, who turned against Eru and all of the Valar. Now, his nature, his love of order that I spoke about just a second ago, if you remember, that was kind of his undoing. He felt that Melkor was a means to an end. Their goals were different. Mairan wished to bring everything to heel. He wished to rule, whereas Melkor wanted to destroy everything and remake the universe in his own image. Now, either Mairan thought that Melkor was going to be a means to an end, or that maybe if Melkor does destroy everything and bring it all back in his image, it will be more orderly and more to Sauron's liking. But that's the choice he made. Melkor and Mairan terrorized Arda during the First Age, and it was then that the elves gave them their insulting names. I already mentioned Sauron, and Gorthaur and all that. Melkor actually means he who arises in might. They started calling him Morgoth, which means dark tyrant. There's a few different translations, but they all basically boil down to dark tyrant in some way or form. So, after the fall of Morgoth, Mairan actually tried to reform. He didn't do what he was told, though. He spoke to Eonwe and asked about, hey, he basically said, hey, look, I'm sorry. I was just following orders. You know, that never works. But he said, I was just following orders. I'm sorry. Could we just forget it all? And Eonwe told him that he would have to go to Valinor and present himself to Manwë, the king of Arda, for judgment. And Sauron did not do that. You know, he did not do that. Whether he must have been very afraid. He must have been afraid of what might happen. So he tried to impress the Valar by doing good deeds. That didn't work. He eventually slid back into evil and became the second Dark Lord. Okay. All right. So this next question, let's see. This is an anonymous one. Why do they never show Morgoth in the movies based on J.R.R. Tolkien's books? In the practical sense, there's no reason to show Morgoth. They've made films out of The Hobbit, and they've made films out of Lord of the Rings, and Morgoth is not really a character in these books. He's mentioned briefly, but he's not a character. They could have used him maybe in the flashback in the intro, giving the lore of the First Age, that he's Sauron's master, but I think that for the average moviegoer, especially people who haven't read the books, it's going to muddy the waters. Because they're like, okay, so Sauron's the main bad guy, but he has a master. They're going to be expecting Morgoth to return at some point, or if that doesn't happen, they're going to expect some sort of sequel where Morgoth returns. And in reality, in the Third Age, Morgoth's part is over. Yes, we have the idea of Dagorath, but that never got written. It was only like a prophecy. So there's also the legal reason. It's sort of a weird, shaky gray area. He was mentioned in Lord of the Rings, so they could mention him in works based off of the Third Age, which is why they're able to say his name and even show him very briefly in Rings of Power. But they don't have the rights to adapt the Silmarillion or Unfinished Tales or any of the other books based upon the First or Second Ages. So it sort of gets into a weird area, and that's another reason why you haven't seen Morgoth in a film. And final question, this is from, oh my god, it's the same guy whose name I'm not sure how to pronounce. I think it's Hal. It's like Joao. It's obviously a Spanish name, and I'm sorry that if I don't pronounce it right. But he asks, if the Balrogs are corrupted Maiar, then would Saruman eventually become one? I see kind of where you got the idea, but Saruman wouldn't become a Balrog because his nature is inherently different, and he's kind of stuck in the body that he has. The Balrogs were spirits of flame. They were powerful Maiar that sided with Melkor, and when they came to Arda, they had bodies that reflected what they would be doing, their nature. So they were beings of fire, they had fiery bodies. The Saruman, on the other hand, is bound to a mortal body. He was sent to Middle-earth in a mortal body by the Valar, and with a limit placed upon his powers. And he's in this body that can get tired, get hungry, get thirsty, even die. He can experience pain. So he can't change his shape. He's stuck. He's bound to this mortal body. And the form of a Balrog isn't necessarily a fallen Maiar. It's just that the form was suitable for those specific 7 Maiar. That's the same reason that Sauron's not a Balrog, for example. But anyway, guys, that's the last question we have for this week, and I managed to keep it about the same length, actually. I try to make these videos a little bit shorter, but I always get going, you know. But I'll see you guys next Wednesday night, where we'll answer some more questions. Like the video, thumbs it up if you liked it, subscribe, hit that bell and everything, and I'll see you guys next time.